Revelation chapter 10, listen to John's word as he speaks. He says, "Then I saw another mighty angel." Catch it, what he's doing. He's coming down from heaven wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun. His legs were like pillars of fire. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and he called out with a loud voice like a lion roaring. When he called out, the seven thunders sounded. And when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write them down, but I heard a voice with heaven saying, "Seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down." And the angel whom I saw standing on the sea and the land raised his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, that there would be no more delay. But that in the days of the trumpet call be sounded by the seventh angel, the mystery of God would be fulfilled, just as he announced to his servants the prophet. Then the voice that I had heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land." So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll, and he said to me, "Take it and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey." And I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel, and I ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it in my stomach, it was made bitter. And I was told, "You must again prophesy about many peoples and nations, language, and kings." True life story of Jeffrey Wigand is a story of courage in the face of people who wanted his truth to be kept silent. Jeffrey Wigand was a high executive within one of the tobacco companies called Brown and Williamson. And he had a truth that if this truth was going to be released would bring judgment on the entire tobacco industry. What did he know? What was this truth? He knew that the tobacco industry knew that nicotine was addictive, even though they said it was not. And he knew that they were willfully adding and manipulating nicotine to make it even more addictive, to keep their sales high at the risk of the public health. As you can imagine, they wanted this news to be kept silent. They wanted to do everything in their power to not allow this truth to be released because they wanted to keep their billions. So what did they do? They put a full on-court press on Jeffrey Wigand's life. They wanted to intimidate him financially. Told him he would no longer have a severance if he ever spoke of this. They wanted to intimidate his health care because they understood that he had a daughter that suffered from great asthma attacks. They did everything in their power to make this man shut. And when his mouth, and when they're trying everything they could with the intimidation, the financial intimidation, and intimidating his health care plan, they began to intimidate him physically. They put people in his house that walked in his backyard without him knowing it. They put a bullet in his mailbox. They threatened him with death threats on the phone through email. They wrote a 500-page paper defacing his character. They threatened him with gag orders, threatened him with jail. They did everything in their power to keep this man from speaking truth. The question I ask you this morning is, what should he do? What should he do? They're threatening his life, his livelihood, his family. What is he supposed to do? Is he supposed to keep quiet for the benefit of his family? Or should he shout this truth from the mountaintops because he knew his truth was going to save lives? What is he supposed to do? See, sometimes others view our truth as dangerous, and they will do everything in their power to keep our mouths from opening and speaking that truth. Is that not the story of the first century church? That here they had this gospel truth that could save so many lives, but Rome saw it as a threat. So they did everything in their power to keep the early church's mouth shut. They intimidated him with finances, said, we won't do business with you, so therefore it's going to hinder you, and therefore don't speak the truth. They physically intimidated them by throwing them in prison, beating them, throwing them in jail, and even killing many as well. What are they supposed to do? What is John supposed to do? We'll see in our passage that he gets another call to go proclaim this gospel. What is he supposed to do? He's on an island already away from his family and friends. And yet now he's called to go proclaim truth again to a nation that's already threatened his life. What's he supposed to do? The question that falls in our laps this morning is, what are we supposed to do? We have a gospel truth that can transform people's eternity. What are we supposed to do? See, as we open up our passage, we've already introduced to two different kind of perspectives. We've seen the early church's perspective of what the church thinks, or even church throughout history, of how they're feeling and dealing with the persecution in the end times. Last week we understood the non-believer's perspective, judgment coming upon them. But this morning we're given John's perspective. John is going to be called again to prophesy. He's called again to this gospel message to speak truth, just as Ezekiel was. And like Ezekiel, he's going out into a battle that's going to be very difficult. And the question that's on his mind is, what is he supposed to do with this? And yet we're going to see that he takes this without hesitation. He does it with a smile on his face. Even there's a great cost. He quickly takes the scroll and says, I'm all in. But what gives him that courage? What allows him the ability to continue on in the midst of pain and suffering all around him? First, we're going to see it's God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. See, here's what's so amazing about this book is John is not afraid to constantly bring up the same topic over and over again. Man, we're making our way through. It's almost like, man, John, didn't you just bring up this topic last week? And John says, yes. But I want it so ingrained in my people's minds that it becomes second nature to them. And he speaks of God's sovereignty, this idea that God is in control of all things. He's sovereign over all. He's sovereign over the good times in our lives, and he is sovereign over the pain and the suffering and the hard times of our lives as well. In fact, notice what he says in our passage. Pick it up with me at the very beginning there. Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and with his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. And he had this little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. There's been many debate on who this angel actually is. Some people say it's Jesus. Obviously, it kind of looks like Jesus. Jesus' face shines like the sun. He has a rainbow, just like we saw earlier in the passage. We see that he even has fire as feet, but the other passage says bronze, but it's very similar. So some people say it's Jesus. Other people say, well, maybe not, simply because we'll see the same angel swear by the one who lives forever and ever. And if it's Jesus, why is he swearing by the one who lives forever and ever himself? Other is the case is, D.A. Carson so wonderfully says that every time we look throughout Revelation, Jesus is never, ever compared to an angel. In fact, the name that we see over and over again is the Lamb. From this point on, this Lamb is going to be the name title that is given of Jesus 21 different times we see it. So who is this angel? Others might think it's Gabriel, a mighty angel. Whoever it is, even though we might not know that specifically, we do know there's a close association with Jesus' power and authority. Because his right leg and the ocean and the land. And the question we ask is, why would John write that to us? Like, why is this picture of this angel with one leg in the sea and the other on land, why is that so important? You see, as we're making our way through Revelation, what we're going to be introduced to in a couple chapters is what many people call the unholy trinity. Satan, the Antichrist, and the prophet, the false prophet. And as you're looking at these three, what we're going to see is that the false prophet and the Antichrist are called the beast of the sea and the beast of the land. The beast of the sea and the beast of the land. And it can look scary, right? They seem to have a lot of control. But what John is saying here is we don't have to fear, because there's only one sovereign Lord. And he is sovereign, as the text clearly shows us, over the land and the sea, everything he has made. Obviously, you can see how this can encourage John to continue on even in the face of the beast coming at him. Because what John is saying is there's this God who is higher and mighty, one who is sovereign over all. So therefore, the one who is in control of my life is not the beast. It's not Domitian. It's not Satan. It's God himself. But God's sovereignty, it can be confusing at times, because there are two forces taking place. Satan wants to destroy us. He's doing everything in his power to make our lives difficult and hard. He's doing everything in his power to get us to question who is actually on the throne. He's doing everything in his power to knock us over, to overwhelm us, to create an anxiety and fear. He's doing his best to get us to question God's love, his care for his family, and his church. But God's sovereignty say these forces are not the same. These forces are not equal. And yes, Satan is using this tool for our destruction, but the text clearly shows us there's another hand on that tool. His hand is stronger. His hand is more sovereign, the only sovereign hand on the tool. And yes, Satan is trying to use a tool for our destruction to get us to question God's authority, but God's hand is on that tool and say, I'm not going to use it for their destruction. Rather, I'm going to use this tool and repurpose it. I'm going to use this tool and repurpose it to conform you to the image of Christ. And as you can imagine, understanding that our God is sovereign, it changes how we look at suffering and pain in this world. Yes, John is overwhelmed. As he's looking out on society, he's seeing agony and pain. Man, we know his life wasn't easy. We know it was incredibly hard. But God is turning to John and saying, let me walk with you through the pain and the suffering. And you're going to get through it on the other side, and it's going to be difficult and hard. It's going to be painful. But on the other side, you're going to look more like my son. That's what he's trying to get us to see. You see what he's saying? The question of God's sovereignty, the question is not will our lives be eliminated, or will not. The question of God's sovereignty is not looking at us and saying, hey, you're going to have an easy life, you won't have any problems, God is just going to erase all those problems. That's not what God's sovereignty says. But rather, we understand John himself was threatened, as church history says, by Domitian himself to put him in a vat of boiling oil to try to kill him. We understand he's already been sent to this island. They want his life. But what God is saying is, I got you, John. Even in the midst of the pain and the suffering and this danger, I'm going to walk you through things that you wish you never had to walk through. I'm going to take you to a valley that you wish you never had to see. But it's this valley that I am conforming your life to show off my glory. And not only your life, but those around you as well. Is that not what the book of Revelation shouts to us? John is exiled away from his family on this island, but notice what's taking place in the midst of his valley. He sees a vision of heaven, and he proclaims it to his church, and it is strengthening the church some 12,000 years after the fact. That's how our God is sovereign. A tool that Satan wanted to use for John's destruction is now used to bless his church. But God's sovereignty is still a mystery, isn't it? That God would use tools of suffering to conform his church. Sometimes it confuses us. But I think Joni Eareckson Tada says it best when she says this, that God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. God allows what he hates, suffering and pain and turmoil, to accomplish what he loves. A church that looks like his son. There's still mystery in that. Still mystery in God's sovereignty and why he allows certain things to happen. And yet, I believe the text speaks to this mystery as well. Notice what it says in verses 3 and 4 when he's speaking of this mystery. He called out, the angel calls out in this loud voice like a lion roaring. When he called out, the seven thunders sounded. And when the seven thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the seven thunders have said and do not write them down. This is the part that gets really confusing. Many theologians have debated what are these seven thunders. And again, we have several different options. Some believe that here's these seven thunders and John's about to write them down, and they say the reason he doesn't write them down is very similar to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 with the thorn in the flesh. He's saying there's something so heavenly, so otherworldly that mortal man can't understand. So to keep himself from getting conceited, he doesn't write these things down. That's one option. Other people say that these thunders represent judgment. Here's seven thunders, seven seals, seven trumpets, seven bowls. So here's this other thing of God's judgment that's going to go out to the nation. But because the other two, or however way you want to look at it, the seals and the trumpets don't bring about change, they don't bring about repentance, God says, hey, I don't want you to write these judgments down because they're not going to happen. In fact, we need to get to the final judgment instead. That's one thought of what's going on. But there's still another. That this is simply speaking of the mystery of God. That here he sees these seven thunders and he's about to write them down but whatever reason, God says, no, I don't want my people to know this. There's parts of God's will that he chooses not to disclose. There's some things that we just will never seem to grasp because he's God and we are man. And yet that's helpful in the midst of suffering in some sort of way. Because there is a mystery. Why would God choose to heal this prayer and not that one? Why would God be so quick in judgment over here, but yet seem not existent in this judgment over there? Why does God intercede sometimes and yet he chooses not to? There's a mystery. There's a mystery in some things we will never seem to fully grasp until we're in heaven. But in the midst of my own questions, I feel a sense of understanding that there's a greater mystery taking place. And I really feel what's happening in this text is John is about to write about these seven thunders, but God is saying, John, there's something greater I need you to write about. There's an urgency that we need to get to something else, and it centers on Jesus. So forget about that. You need to go to what actually is essential, Jesus. In fact, notice what he's saying as he's writing and he's pointing us to these things. He begins to talk about this mystery here. That that he's trying to get to this sense of what is this mystery all about. In fact, notice what he says in the text. He says, then I heard this voice, and I heard from heaven speak to me again, saying, take this scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and the land. So I went to the angel and to him to give him a little scroll, and he said to me, take and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey. And I took this little scroll from your hand, and it was sweet in my mouth, but it made my stomach bitter. But notice what he says at the beginning there in verse 7. He talks about the mystery of God. Mystery of God, what is the mystery of God? Mystery of God, as we're looking at this, is this word mysterion in the Greek. It really speaks to one idea, something that has not been revealed, but now is being revealed. Something not disclosed, but now being disclosed. And every time it's used, almost every single time in the New Testament, it speaks to the gospel. It speaks to Jesus. It points us back to Christ. So notice what he's saying. There's this urgency. No, I need you to get to write this. Hey, we don't have any more time. We need to hit the mystery of God. He said, I need you to see this point. This mystery of God, there's urgency. You know, he says in verse 7, but that in the days the trumpet call sounded the seventh, saying that the mystery of God would be fulfilled, just as announced to his servants and prophets. There's an urgency. And as we're looking at this picture of the mystery of God, as he's pointing us to Jesus, there's another mystery that comes to my mind. Why would God allow his son to suffer? Why would God allow the one who knew no sin to become sin so that I could experience the righteousness of God? Why would God allow his holy son to be the one to bear the judgment of the world? That's the question and the mystery I see. And in the midst of my confusion of why certain things happen, I take solace in the reality that Jesus himself begged to have it another way as well. Remember in the garden when he cries out, may this cup pass from me? And then on the cross when the cup doesn't pass, what does he shout? My God, why have you forsaken me? See, the pain in his words, the agony. See, anytime we discuss suffering on this earth, I cannot do it apart from the reality that my God suffered too. And it's only through the cross that we see comfort in our pain, in our suffering. Not only in the reality that I serve a God who understands my pain and my confusion, but also in the reality that it's only through the cross that my pain is now shifted. My suffering now becomes repurposed. It's redeemed. Because Christ rose from the grave, now my suffering and pain is resurfaced now to be part of my sanctification process, and that only happens through the gospel of Jesus Christ. But notice, John is called. What allows him to take this calling? He says, go and take this scroll, as we see, and yet this scroll, as he says, it's going to be bitter. As you eat it, this scroll is going to be sweet in your mouth, but when it hits your stomach, it's going to be bitter. What is all that about? Well, immediately it takes us back to Ezekiel chapter 2, when Ezekiel is told to eat something, and it's sweet on his mouth, but what do we see in that text? It also becomes a bitter calling upon his life. Sweet in the fact that here's this greatness of being a prophet. Man, you get to be the voice of God himself. Sweet in the fact that you get this privilege to go and proclaim good news to the nations. There's a sweetness to this. But as Ezekiel sees, he's speaking to a group of individuals, Israel, that was going to be non-repentant. They weren't going to change. So yes, there's this sweetness, but as he goes and proclaims the good news, or rather calling for them to repent and change their ways, Israel refuses. So here's Ezekiel. As you understand Ezekiel's life, he's laying on his right side for a full year to try to show that northern Israel is stuck in sin and they need to change. And yet God turns to Ezekiel and he says, you're going to go through some hard things. And guess what? Your people aren't going to change. No, Babylon's going to come in and destroy the temple in Jerusalem. Because of Israel's idolatry, not only outside the temple, but inside the temple as well. And in so many words, he's saying the same thing to John. John, I need you to write this letter. I need you to prophesy to the nations that judgment is coming. But guess what? They're not going to be repentant. But I need you to do it anyway. There's a sweetness. He's called by God. There's a bitterness in the reality that he's going to have to do things that are hard. He's giving his life to show Christ's love. He's giving his life to proclaim this good news, and people aren't going to like it. In fact, sometimes they're going to hate it. They're going to try to persecute him. They're going to try to keep his mouth shut so he doesn't speak this truth. But God calls him to it anyway. What I love so much about this text, John doesn't hesitate. You notice there's no hesitation. He says this is going to be bitter, but he goes and he grabs the scroll anyway. He understands he's already exiled on Patmos. He understands there's so many times in his life in which his life was threatened, and now God is calling him to go speak this news, this same news, the message of Psalm 2, that kiss the Son, and if you don't, he'll be angry and destroy you. And that's the message he's speaking to Rome. Rome doesn't want to hear that news. But there's no hesitation. He goes and he proclaims this gospel message anyway. And we too are called to be God's ambassadors. We're called to go out and proclaim this good news to the nations. And yes, there's a sweetness to that. That God would even consider his people to be ministers of the word, but yet there's a bitterness as well, as we understand persecution comes to those who love him. But I'm reminded of Jeffrey Wigand. After everything he went through, after losing his job, losing his livelihood after the smear campaign of 500 pages was printed in all the newspapers around our nation, after the fact that his wife left him because of this, she couldn't handle the persecution that was taking place, all the death threats, they asked him the question, would you do it again? Would you speak this truth? And he answered, if I had to do it all over again, I would not hesitate, but I would proclaim truth. That be our story. That we too would quickly pick up this mantle to make disciples of all nations. That we too would go out with great joy in our hearts, proclaiming this good news, knowing that persecution will come. But would we do it in the same fashion as John does it? We would do it in the same faithfulness as Ezekiel does it. Would we look throughout church history and be encouraged that those who fought for gospel truth? Why? Because we have a message that just doesn't save just a couple people. It can bring eternity to all. Why do we do this? Why do we want to be a church that goes out and proclaims this good news, no matter what it takes? Because we serve a God who did whatever it took to save you. That's why we do it. That's why we have the opportunity to celebrate communion right now. An opportunity to say, here's this God who's so holy would send his Son to this earth to die a death he shouldn't have died, just so that you and I could be redeemed. And the judgment that we see again throughout Revelation, Jesus takes it upon himself, and that's what we get to celebrate. A God who did whatever it took to save his church.